why businesses fail. That 50% of businesses actually fail in the first 5 years.
The reason why so many businesses go out of business in the first 5 years, right, at an alarming rate, half of them, big contributing factors is,
if I just really drill down to the root cause, it's a lot of ego.
Massive amounts of competitions. How do you differentiate yourself? Welcome to the very first episode of the Startups and Suits podcast. I am Jeremy Kirby, a serial entrepreneur, founder, consultant, advisor.
And I'm Michael Jin. I'm the Suits part of the podcast. I've worked my way up the corporate ladder and now am head of business operations for a business Bay Area tech company.
So today's topic, we're actually going to go over Michael's fascination with Star Wars and his Lego collection.
Ooh, how exciting. I should turn off my camera and turn on my lightsaber. No, we're not actually talking about that. We're going to talk about a topic that should be near and dear to everyone's heart, which is why businesses fail. And there's an incredible stat that we're going to dig into, which is that 50% of businesses actually fail in the first 5 years. So we'll get into that and more on this episode. You know, it's interesting. If I think about failure in businesses and corporate, like it's not what I think, you know, like the startups or small businesses might define as failure. I haven't seen a lot of companies that I've worked for, go under, in terms of that kind of failure. My definition of failure in the corporate setting is basically, if you're failing, reorg, and that'll buy yourself, at least a couple of years.
Sure.
But what's your view on failure of businesses?
So it's interesting, right? Because you come from corporate America, I come from startup. I live there. You live in corporate. And I think there's different levels to it, right? I think there's startup world, which is, and I've echoed this numerous times in some of the past podcasts and stuff. But to me, a startup is a temporary org that's looking for a scalable and repeatable business model. Yep. That's like the bottom, right? Like you're basically just a group of friends, a group of people that are looking for a solution or looking to create something that can scale. And then once you find that, then you move into an organization. So there's that level. But then I also think there's the level of like your typical mom and pop shop,
yep,
your local restaurant, your local sporting goods store. I don't know what we want to call those. I mean, maybe we call them mom and pop shops. But then you have the big corporate, right? Like you said, where you typically don't ever see a big corporation go under. They just kind of reorg, or they split off, or they get acquired, or
yep. Unless something goes really wrong, they usually don't fold.
Enron.
Yeah, Silicon Valley Bank.
Yeah, we could probably name off a handful.
Yeah. There's examples out there, but it's more rare, certainly, right? Maybe we just use the term like mom and pop shop or just small, medium-sized businesses.
But let's call it small business because I think that's typically what it is. I think mom and pop just sounds kind of weird. I think it's definitely small business, and then there's the big corps. I think there's probably multiple layers, but for simplicity's sake, let's just keep it there with the three. I wonder, you said the stat about 50% of the businesses fail in the first 5 years.
Yeah.
I wonder what it is in the first 2 years. I really think it's drastic, right? If you make it to year 5, you're probably doing better than you did at year 2. So I would expect that number is probably way higher at year 2 or 3.
Yeah.
I mean, just based on past businesses too. Like, I mean, there's startups that I ran that didn't make it past, 12 months, 14 months before I had to. I didn't close up. I actually pivoted to a different product or service, but I mean, we'll get into that later in the episode. But I think for the sake of like categorizing it, let's call it startups, let's call it small businesses,
Yep,
and then let's call it big corp.
I'm good with that.
That sound about right? Okay.
Yeah, I'm good with that. And I hearing you talk, like my mind's like kind of on this whole idea of let's not talk 5 years, but in the more short term, like 1 to 2 years. And, it's interesting, like, and I want to get your take on the startup side of this, but, one of the things I see around why like an idea or a product or something fails in corporate is a lot of times it takes big corporations forever to get something to market. Mm-hmm. And so really like you miss out on the window of opportunity. Like we may have an idea, we may want to release a feature, we may have customers in regions that are super excited about it, but the window of opportunity is short term. It might be like 6 months to a year. But, with the bureaucracy, with the development, just the slowness, like it might take us a year and a half to get freaking the thing launched. And then by the time you launch, like all your clients that were interested were like, sorry, we moved on. Somebody else gave it to us faster, or we don't need it anymore. And then you spend all that time and you're stuck.
There's 20 startups that already did it 2 weeks ago, and you're still trying to figure out the whole roadmap and plan behind it to present to your hierarchy.
Yeah.
This is why I love startup world, because I love to move fast and break shit. And I use the analogy all the time, right? Like a big cruise ship is harder to turn in the ocean than a small John boat.
Yep.
So if you can stay small and nimble, you can just drive circles around some of these bigger ships. And so I love the speed and the chaos of the startup world, because you can just come up with an idea, create a test, beta test it, see if it works, gather data. If it doesn't work, cool, you scrap it, you're on to the next thing because it didn't bankrupt you, because you didn't deploy all this capital. In the meantime, the big guys at the big corps are still trying to figure out the roadmap and allocation of resources and approval processes. Like you said, all the bureaucracy. And I can't stand that. I can't stand that. That's one of my biggest pet peeves. Like, you see a good idea out there, you got to jump on it, because I feel like speed is key.
I totally agree. I think speed is key. I think taking action, to your point, is key. Because even if I think about the startup side, like, my second job as a real estate agent, like I look at some real estate agents out there, like sometimes they have great ideas, but again, it's and in theory they could execute much faster by themselves than a big corporation could. But then what holds them back sometimes is, they might be thinking about too many ideas and they just get paralyzed too. And they don't take action. They don't take consistent action either. And so that could, on the startup side, I feel like that's a potential pitfall of why like some businesses could fail, is they never even get started.
So it's funny you say that, because I'm literally right in the middle of a project. We're about it's been about 6 months, 7 months now in the startup phase. And we just raised a bunch of capital. We found a scalable, repeatable business model. So we're kind of moving into that whole structure now of like, okay, we found something, we've got the funding for it. Now let's start to build out the team to execute on the visions. And one of the things that we're struggling with is we have too many ideas, right? Like, everybody has ideas. We can sit here and come up with 100 ideas, but if you don't actually execute on them, they're no good. And so it got to the point where we had so many different directions that we could go, that I had to use, like, I talked to the other founders the other day, and I was like, look, we need to think about this. We have limited resources, right? We raised some money, but it's not like we raised, a $20 million or $30 million, Series A round, right? We did a friends and family round for a small amount. We got some working capital. We're ready to go.
Yep.
But I was like, you got to look for the lead domino, right? Like I call it the lead domino. Like, what can we do right now that makes everything else fall into place? And we need to stay laser focused on that, because we can start dabbling in all these different areas and all these different things. And then next thing you know, our resources are gone and we never really took anything to market because we were spread a little bit too thin. So finding that lead domino that makes everything fall into place, or looking for the path of least resistance. Like, what is low hanging fruit right now that you can grab to start?
I was just about to say that, because corporate, it's all about like prioritization too, right? And so, but I think that applies for whether it's big corp, small, medium-sized businesses, or startups. It's like, you have a lot of ideas. How do you prioritize them, given the time, the resources, the assets that you have? And yeah, it's low-hanging fruit. Like, what actions or what decisions can you make? What things can you start working on? Lowest level of effort, lowest cost potentially, right? But gives you the highest return. And you really have to just evaluate that and understand that, so you can lay things out appropriately.
Yeah. So, like I kind of want to rewind for a second here. So let's go back to their overall thesis is that half the businesses fail at the 5-year mark, right? And we've already categorized things into 3 different buckets. We said startups, we said small businesses, and we said big corps. Big corps, I don't know that and this would be interesting, and maybe we should do a little bit of research here, but big corporations aren't the ones that are going out of business in 5 years, correct?
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's the startups and the small businesses that are the ones that are going out of business at that alarming rate of 50%. Why are they going out of business? Like what is it specifically that startups and small businesses are doing incorrectly to go out of business where big corporations aren't? Is it, I mean, obviously it's runway, right? You got to have enough runway to keep the
Runway is
lights on.
capital, right? Yeah, I think businesses have a lot more runway to work with. It's funny, when you were saying that in my head, all I was thinking about was, yeah, big businesses don't go out of business in 5 years, but executives sure do.
Yeah, but then you got the revolving door of executives, right? It's
I mean, that happens, right? You see that all the time.
Yeah, they just jump to a different company, they get hired somewhere else, and they tank that
get another
business.
5 years. Yeah. But no, I agree with you. I think startups, small businesses, like runway, I think plays a big factor in it. I mean, I put my real estate lens on. I feel like it's a lack of focus could play a role into it. A lack of clear goals. I mean, I've interviewed enough real estate agents, and the ones that are really successful, what I've seen is they had something that they were working for, whether that's, multiple streams of income, whether that's, for a family member, whatever it was, there was a deep rooted goal and target that they had in mind. That really got them through the tough times, or when business wasn't where they wanted it to be. They had a clear goal that they could focus on, so they knew where they were going. I don't know if all startups have that, but I mean, curious to hear your perspective.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the real estate game to me is a very simplistic one, because you've already got product market fit, right? You've got people that need a home or people that want a home, and you have real estate agents that are doing the paperwork and helping these people find a home. So there's already that product market fit, right?
Yep.
There's already a market for that. And the revenue model behind it. We don't need to go into the entire business model behind a real estate agent, but it's just basic supply and demand to me. Now, where it gets tricky is, and actually, you know what, now that I say that, this could be kind of broken down into a few different things, right? Because in my mind, startups are temporary organizations that are looking for a scalable and repeatable business model. And sometimes it's looking for problems to solve, or sometimes it's looking for something that we can surprise and delight a customer with. It's funny because I don't necessarily think real estate is actually in that same bucket, because I mean, maybe it's just such an old industry, right? It's been around forever. Everybody needs a home. The real estate agents are the ones that connect the home buyers with the paperwork and stuff, right? And in my mind, I'm thinking startup realm, and maybe it's because I'm so close to Silicon Valley here, as you are, that how do we solve this problem, and how do we use AI, and how do we leverage all these different, you're trying to solve these problems that have never been solved before. So I feel like there's maybe two different types of categories there. I mean, we might be getting deep in the weeds here.
I mean, maybe, but I think about real estate. I agree with you. There is product market fit. People need a house. You're helping them get a house. But from a supply and demand perspective, there's so many agents now.
But then that's just a marketing problem now, right? How do you market
it's a marketing problem, but then it's isn't it how you market yourself, potentially finding basically how you fit that. Essentially, you're your own product, right? And how are you fitting the market need where you are to be able to sell your product, because you have somebody else that's literally selling the same product?
That's a tough one, right? Because now you just got massive amounts of competitions. How do you differentiate yourself? Is it just a marketing play? Is it utilizing tools better? Is it offering a more personalized service to make your clients or your customers feel like you're more trustworthy than the other? I mean, buying a home is a big purchase, so I would think that trust factor is probably number one on the list. That's an interesting one. I'll go back to a scenario. Gosh, this was probably 15 years ago. Man, that was a long time ago. I created a product that I created an idea, or I had an idea that I thought was needed in the baseball space, where, this was back when Airbnb and Uber were big. And I was like, I'm going to create the Airbnb and the Uber of travel baseball. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was going to build this platform that connected baseball coaches with parents looking for teams. And then I was going to create this double-sided marketplace that would allow parents to search for teams that were close by. And then I was going to allow the coaches to search for players and link them. And so I built out this whole platform, and I did this for about a year. And then once I got into it and I started really trying to market it, I figured out that there was way more issues on the back end that I knew, where, how am I going to update the teams? Because the teams are a revolving door too, right? Like one team's around for 3 months and then it's gone. And how am I going to audit the platform and make sure that these teams are still around? So there was like all these things that I didn't think about at the time. And ultimately, I ended up just scrapping the project because there was no use for it, because it wasn't really a need. I had kind of made up this problem in my head, and I thought that I was solving it, but I didn't really do the market research and talk to very many people to figure out, hey, this isn't really a problem. And I probably could have saved myself a ton of time and money in doing something different. But so like there's a story right there that kind of emphasizes like that product market fit. Like, I didn't have that. And I had already built out this whole product thinking that I did. So I think that product market fit might be a big contributor to why startups go out of business so quick, because they don't truly have that market fit that they think before they deploy all the capital in building.
And you highlighted something there that's important. And I think it's important in the startup world and in the corporate world is, are you going out and talking to people and validating
not
your
friends and
market
family
fit? Yeah, not just friends and family, not just
right?
people that are going to be yes people, right?
No, nobody has ugly babies. You can't ask your mom and dad. You have to get out and ask your future customers.
Yes, exactly. And that would be an interesting stat to see. Like how many, like, I don't even know if it's available, but I am curious, like how many do fail because they never even bother to talk to enough people or the right people.
I mean, I've seen so many projects. I've been involved in a lot of projects in the startup world. There's some out there right now that I consult with, and I'm an advisor for a few. And I feel like they're making that same mistake that I did early on in my career, where I had an idea, I built it out, and then I said, hey, look, guys, look what I built. And nobody wanted to buy it because it wasn't really solving a problem. I see it all the time. And how do you talk to people, or how do you get them to understand that there's different ways to go about it? It's one of the hardest things that I have to deal with, because you can't tell somebody that their idea is bad, or you can't tell them that their idea should be put on pause while you go out and do more research. Like, you can slowly hint at it, but it's like, that's one of the biggest like pits in my stomach that I have to deal with on a daily and weekly basis, of just seeing people deploying capital on projects that I strongly feel like there is no product market fit, because they actually didn't create that. They created their own problem and they're thinking they're solving it, and it's really not a problem. So I don't know how to deal with that on a consulting basis, man. It's tough.
I mean, it is really tough. I mean, yeah.
How about from a small business perspective? Like, let's go into small business. Why do they fail? Like a local restaurant. Let's say just your local, your local restaurant, Italian food.
Are we taking out, like external factors like act of God, economy going down in the tanker, COVID, things like that? Because I'm assuming, like, especially over the last few years, that probably plays a significant factor in why some of these small businesses go out of business.
I don't know that you can blame the economy.
Okay.
I definitely think that you should eliminate the act of God, right?
Yeah.
Like storms and COVID and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because you can't really prep for that. But I feel like the economy is something that you've always got to be paying attention to. You'd be foolish to not really be keeping an eye on what's happening in the economy across the entire United States, even the world for that matter, right? Depending on what industry you're in. But you've got to be paying attention to what's coming. And if you get caught off guard, it's your fault because you weren't paying attention.
I mean, though, do you feel like small business owners? I mean, I'm thinking like restaurant in particular right now because that's what you mentioned. Like, do you feel like they have the time to even pay attention to things like that? I mean, maybe U.S. economy, maybe world economy. I really don't know. I'm laughing because in my head I'm imagining all these like small business owners who are like, just economics like gurus.
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't know if they do.
I have a question for you then. If there's a follow up.
Yeah.
I'm going to label this in two ways.
Okay.
Is the restaurant, is it owned and operated by the owner, right? Like, is the mom and the dad and the son and the daughter, are they all in the restaurant serving the food, cooking the food, doing all the work? Or is it a business guy behind the scenes that is creating a business where the mom and dad are actually creating a job, right? Because I think that's two different things.
It is. That's a good point. It is two different things.
So if you're a mom and a dad and a family, like if you're a family-owned restaurant and you're in the business working, you basically created your job. You don't own a business, you own a job. Because if you leave and you go on vacation, like, you can't sustain it. It closes its doors, right? So if you can't leave for 6 months, it's not really a business, it's a job. That makes it difficult to pay attention to the economy, right? And all these outside sources, because you're so knee deep in the day-to-day business of, I got to order the food, I got to do this, I got to make sure the doors are open, I got to clean. Like, I could totally understand how those types of businesses would really, really struggle to pay attention to the economy. But if you're a guy that's opening a restaurant as a business and you're hiring things out, you should have the time to be able to look at those external things and see things coming. Granted, you can't see everything coming. I think it's foolish to think that, but you should be able to pay attention to what's happening around and
if you're an investor in a small business and you're listening to this, I would love for you to leave a comment and validate our assumptions. I really want to know.
You're completely wrong. I mean,
I really, really want to know. We're using this podcast to to also pressure test some of the things that we throw out there too.
Yeah. Well, we're both in the industry, man. Like, this is actually helping us too, right? Like, just talking through this helps me out with future endeavors and some of the businesses that I'm involved with now. Like, I love getting the insights from you. And then if somebody comments, and like, we're also learning too. So I think that's what makes this so great. Podcasts are great because we can all kind of learn together. We're definitely not experts, but we're enthusiasts and we're practitioners. We're in it, actually doing it.
Well, and I think where the conversation is leading, and I think what we're kind of alluding to, and I want to call it out specifically, and we can kind of dig into this a little bit more, is, if you're an investor, you're paying attention to the economy. In theory, you are, and you see most things, general macro trends, things that are coming along that you need to adjust to. Big businesses, probably big corporations, probably do the same. Startups, to some degree, probably also, like you were talking about earlier, is finding that right product market fit. If you don't, what do you do next? And I think it really lends to this idea of like, when and how do you pivot? And potentially it could be one of those things where some businesses go under, similar to what you were sharing earlier, is because they didn't pivot in time. They might have, understood they didn't have a product market fit, but maybe they convinced themselves that like, this is still the direction I'm going to go down. This is still like, the problem I want to solve, and they just don't move on from that. So let's talk about like pivoting for a second. Like, what's your view on that?
Oh boy. I'm trying to think. I mean, it's such a cliche term now in 2025, right? I almost feel like the word pivot is kind of like an old term, but it's so relevant still.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think through some of the quote unquote pivots that I've done. So prime example, here we go. So thinking back to my hypothetical Airbnb and Uber of travel baseball, right? That on the surface looked kind of cool and looked like it was actually solving a problem, but wasn't. In the midst of all that, I realized that when I was doing it, there wasn't really a need for what I thought there was, right? There wasn't a need to connect parents with coaches and coaches with parents and vice versa. But what I ended up learning was that there was a huge boom in travel baseball tournaments And there's a lot of big sports complexes around the area that were starting to fill, and there was a need for expansion because travel baseball was booming. There was not enough fields to play on. There was a supply problem with facilities.
Okay.
And so that made me immediately think, well, instead of trying to cater to the coaches and the parents, connecting them and doing this project, why don't I use my connections and start to reach out to all these coaches that I had already dealt with on this platform? And why don't I start hosting baseball tournaments myself because I had access to certain fields? So in a way, we can kind of call that a pivot where I thought I was going to be the Airbnb and Uber of, God, I even hate saying that. It just sounds so corny now. But that's what I thought I was going to be in the travel baseball industry. And what it ended up being was me pivoting into becoming a travel baseball tournament provider, because I had all the coaches and the database, right? Because I was doing this project, trying to connect them with parents. But ultimately, the parents weren't really my customer. It was the coaches. The coaches needed help. The coaches needed somewhere to play. The coaches needed somewhere that they can go for a weekend and they could charge their parents. So instead of focusing on two different customer segments, I honed in on the coaches and only one of them, and started running travel ball tournaments. And then that kind of ballooned into everything else. So that's just me kind of jumping into the weeds and doing it and being aware of what was happening. But I could have saved myself a lot of time if I actually talked to people out of the gate before I spent a year and a bunch of money trying to build out this platform. So I think pivots are great. I think they're necessary for a lot of people.
Yep. And I feel like they're very hard in corporate.
I mean, is there such a thing in corporate? Is it typically just like not a pivot, but let's start a different division, let's fund it, and let's see if that goes? Is that more of what happens?
I mean, I would say there's micro versus macro pivots, right? I would say like some micro pivots, like smaller pivots, like, let's change the pricing, right? Let's change our commercialization, distribution, go to market strategy, but it usually revolves around the same product or product suite, right? I feel like once a decision's made on a larger product, it's harder to make those wholesale bigger pivots to say, okay, we're just going to completely sunset this product because it's not working, and we're going to try and go with something new. That macro pivot, for lack of a better term, is what I feel like is really hard in corporate. And I think one of the reasons behind that is just there's a lot of ego. I mean, if I just really drill down to the root cause, it's a lot of ego. Mm-hmm. Because if I think about the cycle from beginning to end of like how you bring a product to market, you have to find the fit. You got to get buy-in from executives. You got to like figure out your pricing strategy, your go-to-market commercialization strategy. You got to figure out like, once you set your pricing, then you do all your revenue projections. You get everybody rah excited about it, right? They see the big numbers, their eyes go wide, and everybody says, okay, yes, go. Then you go, and you're not seeing the results that maybe you hope for, right? But you don't want to tell like executives that like you should. I mean, you probably should, but I think a lot of what I see a lot in corporate culture is, you spin the story a little bit. It's like, oh, the hockey stick growth is coming. Mm-hmm. If we reprice it, the hockey stick growth is coming. If we just, focus on this segment versus that segment, the hockey stick growth is coming. And oftentimes, like, when you do forecasts and subsequent forecasts, you end up like inflating and then inflating and then inflating your numbers some more. And then you go from basically like you survive for a year, you survive for another 2 years, and then you get to the 5-year mark and okay, it didn't work. Let's reorg. But honestly, I feel like ego gets in the way a lot of truly being able to pivot as quickly as like startups and small businesses can.
Well, you're admitting failure at that point, right?
Yeah,
you're
and nobody likes to admit failure, especially not.
Yeah, you're basically saying that like, hey, sorry, I was wrong. We need to now go this route. Like, yeah, that's definitely an ego thing, and especially in corporate, right? But we always joke around about it off camera here, but I always say that in corporate America, their sole job is to not get fired.
Pretty much.
And so
Pretty much.
if you're like, you get to a certain level and your sole goal is to just not get fired because you've already worked your way up the ladder to a certain position. And if you have to pivot and you have to admit that you were wrong, you could be on the chopping block. So I could see how there's a little bit of bureaucracy there.
Well, in the
Startup
funny
world, we don't have to deal with that.
no startup world, you don't have to deal with that. Corporate world, yeah, the higher up you go on the ladder, the less accountability you actually want to take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This has kind of been a good one. Like this is something that we kind of see on an everyday basis, right? Companies going in and out of business all the time, companies pivoting to different products or services. But I think ultimately, to kind of summarize this whole entire segment is, I feel like the reason why so many businesses go out of business in the first 5 years, right, at an alarming rate, half of them, is to me that the sole, I don't want to say the sole purpose, but one of the big contributing factors is product market fit. They're not solving a problem that somebody is willing to pay for. They either made up a problem in their head and created something and tried to sell it, or they just flat out didn't have a good idea, or they were too quick to move from startup phase into actually scaling and deploying capital and trying to grow an actual business. They didn't test it enough, or they weren't paying attention like I did that one time where, I thought that I was building this platform that connected everybody and it was just a big waste of time, but then ultimately led into a pivot. Like if people aren't aware and paying attention to those potential pivots, they could run out of runway, that money's gone and they have no option but to close up. And then when they reflect on it, they could probably look back on it and say, I probably should have went this route. I had, like, it was right there for the taking, but I was blinded because I thought my idea was good. And so maybe there's a little bit of ego. Maybe there's a little bit of ignorance. Maybe there's a little bit of lack of education as far as like when's the right time to scale, when's the right time to pivot. All these things are fascinating, but I think that kind of summarizes why so many go out of business in the first 5 years.
Yeah. And I think just to your point, I mean, I'm just locked in on ego. Like, I think you just have to be honest with yourself, and it's one of those things. It's kind of like goals too, right? It's like you set goals for the year. Don't wait until the end of the year to evaluate how you're doing against your goals. And I would say same thing with like pivots, right? Finding product market fit. Like you have to be constantly pressure testing, your product, the market fit, any kind of assumptions that you feel like you might be making. If you feel like you're not the type of person that can be honest with yourself, like surround yourself with people that can like question you, that are not just going to say yes. That can help you identify like potential early warning signs that you may not be able to see yourself.
And don't ask your mom and dad if your idea is good. Because
don't ask your mom and dad. Don't ask your brother. Don't ask your wife. Don't ask any family members.
No.
Ask me and Jeremy. We'll tell you. We'll tell it to you straight.
Send us a comment with your ideas. I promise we won't steal them.
We won't steal them. And if they're crap, we'll tell you they're crap. I am a straight shooter. I will tell you it's crap. Just don't hate me for it.
Right on. Well, I mean, this was a good one. I look forward to the next episode, but this one's kind of near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad we started off with this one. We talk about it all the time. I mean, we live this kind of on a daily basis, but it's one of the biggest topics that I write about, things that I think about on a daily and weekly basis, just because of the consulting and the advising that I do. It's something that comes up every single day. And
frankly, like, I mean, I feel like we kind of just like skim the surface of this topic. Like we can go so much deeper on this. So, if the audience is interested, like we can certainly we should dive deep into some of your experiences, case studies, like there's a lot of examples out there and lessons learned that we can certainly hit in on more on future episodes. So love this conversation and looking forward to the next one.
Before we end it, do you have a favorite pivot?
Do I have a favorite pivot? Mine always comes back to the one that I kind of grew up with is always, the lack of a pivot. Blockbuster and Netflix, right?
Yep.
That's literally what I grew up on. I remember being a kid, going to my local Blockbuster store, renting out the game, renting out the VHS,
Yep.
Don't judge me but for my age with that comment. And then, you know, like when Netflix started, like just literally getting like the DVDs in the mail. And, you know, before you know it, like Blockbuster's closing its doors because they never thought Netflix was ever in a million years going to displace them, you know, and now Netflix is a streaming giant and winning Oscars. So
it's a monster.
It's a monster. Yeah, that's mine. What about you?
I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to go a little bit on the radical side, but I'm going to, maybe this is a little clickbaity, but I'm going to say,
okay.
And I only say that because started out as a creator platform that put content behind a paywall so that content creators could charge for their content. Little did they know that females were going to exploit that and start creating what they did on the platform. And the founders sitting back going, well, I mean, what I thought was going to be this is now this, and it's generating so much revenue and there's so many users growing, you kind of have to embrace the pivot. And so I kind of use that one all the time, and it's maybe a little X-rated and a little bit clickbaity, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that probably my favorite pivot from the outside. I've got some internal pivots that I like, but from the outside, like that was a major pivot that made a lot of money and disrupted a lot of things, and continues to disrupt a lot of things. So I'll leave it there. I won't go any deeper on that one.
Love it.
I think that's the end of the episode right there.
I think so. Mic drop on the pivot.
Oh, shit.